Welcome to Impact Farming, where we introduce you to the people and ideas that will have a massive impact on your farming operation. Brought to you by Farm Marketer. Sit down, start the engine, and let's roll with today's show.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Impact Farming Show. Today we have two awesome guests joining us. We have Andrea and Joel from Farm Credit Canada. How are you guys?
Yeah, really good. Excited to be here.
Good.
Thanks for having us.
I am so excited to have you guys here to continue on the conversation of sweat equity on the farm. We have a really exciting episode planned, guys. We're taking a bit more of the numbers, the academic, and then we're really going into Andrea and Joel's experience and tapping into some of the different scenarios and work they've done with different clients. So I'm really excited. A boots on the ground approach. So welcome, guys. Before we dive in, why don't you tell our audience a little bit about each of you guys?
Sure, I can. You want me to jump in first? I can kind of roll with mine. So yeah, excited to be here. For most of my career, I've kind of been working with farms in farm management area and policy, kind of from business planning to succession. And I have a background in degree in commerce and a master's in economics. And really passionate about helping farms kind of figure out this transition space. And excited to do this through FCC. So.
Perfect. Thank you. Andrea?
So I've actually had a little bit of a different experience. I did about 14 years in the lending role. So I was working with Farm Credit as well as a bank, and I was working in agriculture as well as commercial, working mostly with various different kinds of farms. And so in that kind of role, transition always came up. But it was from the perspective of how can we make this work? Can we, is the cash flow going to support it? So it's really nice to be able to bring the experience from my lending days and then apply it in this role to say, okay, now we can take it a step further and talk about human resources, talk about management, and talk about some of the softer issues that really are a huge part of the conversation. It can't just be all about the numbers. And so my husband and I actually farm outside of Stratford. So that's another great experience that Joel and I both come from family farms. And so we're walking the walk and talking the talk, I guess, in from some of the perspectives of what we do.
Excellent. I'm so excited to have you guys. Why don't we dive right in, and I'll get you guys to define sweat equity. What is it and why does it come into play on family farms?
Yeah, and so I think like as a general definition, this is something that forms probably almost some part of every conversation that Andrea and I would end up in. But if we kind of chat about it really loosely, I think it's really comes down to kind of an agreement and matching expectations a little bit, but really trying to find a way to compensate maybe the next generation as they look to enter the business, trying to find a bit of that magic formula for how do we compensate them as they come in and look to become the future partners of this business with the senior generation. And so I think it forms a lot of a compensation part of a conversation, but bleeds into kind of all the other areas of transition as well. And so I think really loosely, it's about finding a bit of a formula that sometimes on farms, we are a bit of an equity business. And so it is something that as an equity business, sometimes we have asset values and equity on our farm, but we don't necessarily always have cash on hand to necessarily compensate that next generation when they come in directly. So I think the sweat equity piece is almost like as somebody comes back into the business, they're putting in their labor and they're working, and maybe it's at a little bit of reduced wage for some kind of future expectation of equity. And so I think something Andrea and I were chatting a little bit about, but it's almost like a kind of deferred wage that you're being strategically patient, that you're earning a wage in the short term and kind of looking at how equity might form part of that compensation over time. And so I think today we'll probably chat a lot about how we formalize that process. But.
Okay. And, that makes a lot of sense. Sorry, Andrea, I'll get you to expand. I'm thinking too, I always walk the fence leg on both sides of the fence when it comes to business in the farming world and the non-farming world. And I take a lot of that traditional non-farming and try and bring that to the farm world where possible. And if you look at it, I started Farm Marketer, and at the very beginning, there's zero revenue, literally. So you pay yourself very small wage. And as you grow, you're conservative, right? Because you need those funds to make the business grow. So same type of thing in the farm operation, right? If you're worth $100,000 a year in the marketplace, but the farm can't afford to pay you that, well, then that's where the sweat equity comes in, right? Go ahead, Andrea. Sorry, I cut you off there.
That's a great point. And that does lead into some of the conversations that we have when we're discussing sweat equity, is recognizing that next generation as your business partner. And just as you mentioned, these are businesses and they are complicated. And so switching the term from father to son to business partners does change a little bit of the dynamic of how you're going to have that conversation. Because when it's dad and son, it's a personal conversation. And just as you mentioned, when you're a business, you're going to have a very different expectation. And there's also this idea that you're going to continually grow in the business. So maybe you start in a labor position and then you're moving to a manager position. And then ultimately your end goal is that you're wanting to be a co-owner or a business partner. And so if we can change a little bit of the dynamics of even the terms that we're using, then we can recognize sweat equity for kind of what it is. It's a contribution, it's a recognition of what you're doing. So that really is a big part of why people want to be recognized for their sweat equity, is because they've shown commitment and they want to ensure that they can continue to do that.
I love it. Okay. So we know that many of the farms have the sweat equity in play at some level, but I've heard you guys mention that it can become a bit of a bigger problem over time. And there's some things that you guys want to share on that. Can you expand?
Well, I think for starters, it would be great to recognize that sweat equity is one part of the plan for the whole transition. And so when you don't acknowledge that, and it goes on not maybe for 5 years, but maybe 10, maybe 40 years, all of a sudden, those expectations that Joel was talking about, they grow over time. And so it really depends. The conversation around sweat equity depends on what's going on in the business. Because if a 20-year-old comes to the table with the idea that, well, I want to talk about sweat equity and I want to have a process so that I have an equity position, that's great. That's very different than if we have a 75-year-old who still has all ownership and all control, and we have 2 generations behind them. Those are very different conversations, and sweat equity in those contexts means a lot more, and it's a lot more complicated than a 20-year-old. Time matters.
Yeah. And I think it is a completely different thing, that exactly that you're trying to match maybe expectations over time. So this is maybe why it becomes such a big problem over time, is when we haven't set those expectations early on, that often we have different perspectives or different memories of what we each expected. And I know we maybe have some examples for later on that we can run through, but it's something that I think in our world you see all the time, that the family kind of hasn't come to the table and kind of match that with each other. So oftentimes both generations are a little bit at odds about what that compensation might have looked like over time, or what that meant. And then speaking of what Andrea mentioned a little bit early, what was the value, I guess, monetarily, but also for me, investing my life kind of back in the farm and getting to work with my family and things like that, was it valued and appreciated as part of that conversation. And so where I think sweat equity is something we both like to see as kind of almost a yearly conversation, is something that families might review annually as part of their business planning discussions and things like that. So they'd be meeting as business partners and talking through, okay, as we talked about labor, we've had this conversation and this is what we expect to be part of labor. And now you're farther in the business as a manager, and maybe there are some things that we can do differently to recognize equity and wages as you almost get promoted in some way. And now you're into ownership, and what might that mean for your sweat equity and involvement as a family and a business over time. So lots of different things to kind of dissect and unpack there, but I think being as clear as possible helps make sure that those expectations match for all family members.
I love that. I'm going to go on a little bit of a riff here, like I'm known to do. But to me, I think it's important in a family farm operation to be clear. Elaine Phrase has this line: clarity is kindness. In the traditional business, you have annual reviews. You're always talking to your employees about stuff. You need to be clear. But sometimes I find in family operations, well, there's dynamics and maybe an assumption, well, we don't need to talk. We know we all know what the plan is. But you know what, to me, especially when a generation's coming back in this transition, I think if you're not clear and you don't have these discussions about wages and the transition process, it's not kind. And I think often people avoid the conversations to avoid fights. But to me, I'm totally going on a riff because I've seen this happen. I feel it happen. When you avoid it, you do more damage in the end. So really, just rip the darn Band-Aid off, have an uncomfortable meeting that feels uncomfortable. It's a heck of a lot better than having quiet resentment on farms. And I've seen it happen. I hear it happen. I know lots of friends and family that farm. Happens all the time. So anyways, my rift is almost done here, but I love the fact that you guys brought that up. This should be formally discussed and discussed regularly, right?
And the other part that I think we've talked about a lot before coming to this podcast is the fact that we need to recognize that sweat equity is a labor contribution. But because you're giving an equity portion of your business, it makes it more complex, especially in Canada, where we have farms that are worth a lot of money. And when we look at it as a national level, you can't have a conversation about farm equity without having a conversation about land.
Yep.
So on a national level, 69% of the farm assets are derived from land. And if you kind of take that back another notch, an increase in value each year for like the last 10 years or so nationally, which means the land is doubling every 12 years. Yeah. We have transitions that usually take, 5 to 10 years to do. And in that time frame, it's almost doubling.
Wow. So
we have a labor dynamic, and then we have a huge equity portion that's increasing. It's hard to match those two because they don't match in terms of the value. And then secondly, that's a lot of movement. That's a lot of moving pieces at any given time. So I'm a big proponent of naming the hard, and the land prices and the increase that we've had, especially, like from the east to west coast, there's a lot of differences in our country. So we need to recognize that as part of the conversation. And that's going to take a little bit of that personal sensitivity out of it, saying, you know what, this is a bigger issue than just the people at the table. We're trying to come up with a process, and the world is changing annually. So I think it's really important to remember that when we're having a conversation about sweat equity, it does lead to the bigger transition plan. So you start with your here's my ploy. So you start with your sweat equity and then keep going, because that's not going to be the whole plan. And some people say, well, we just need to get, the sweat equity portion of it controlled, and then the rest will figure itself out. And I would like to challenge them to say, you get that portion of it, and then we're going to maybe continue the conversation to say, what does purchased equity look like? What does family gifted equity look like? What does the business plan look like that's going to continue this conversation? So this is a step, but it's not the whole transition plan. That's my speech for today.
Those are big conversations that you guys have with farmers. Kudos to you. Those are some big shoulders you have. That's big and emotional and complicated. And wow. Anyways, kudos to all you farm advisors. Okay, so that is Perfect. I think that's a great spot to roll into the next point that we want to talk about. You work with farm families, you guys and your team at Farm Credit Canada, you work with farm families right across the country. Boots on the ground, you're dealing with this all the time. I wanted to get you guys to share frameworks, best practices, calculations, anywhere that you want to go that can start to provide some farmers with some tangible tools. Take it away, you guys.
Yeah, and I think that's a great way to do it. And so something exactly to Andrea's point, right, is starting small almost with this one, that it is hard and it's hard to do, but it doesn't mean that it can't be done by kind of segmenting things out. And honestly, and then it kind of, as you're riffing before, it always brings me back to this analogy that we tend to avoid these things because we don't want to put them on the table. And I think families build a bit of a monster in their mind about how difficult a transition plan can look like. And so you say, well, let's come back to this a year from now and we'll think it over and we'll put it on the table and maybe not go through this formula now, but we'll park it, and you come back a year later and the monster is a foot bigger, right? Because you've put it off and things like that. And so completely agree. I think bringing some math into things and just as almost a guide to how you have these transition conversations really helps you pull out what you value as a family when you go into these things. It gets into discussion about what's fair and equal. So you deal with a lot of big concepts, but using the math and things like that as a bit of a process guide can really get you to where you want to be. And so I know we each have a few different thoughts on how they can be used, but when we're kind of starting that one segment or one sliver of the transition plan around sweat equity, I know something that we talk about a lot is kind of keeping it simple at first and just starting to recognize, okay, you've come back into the business as labor, and how have we compensated you in the past? And so looking at things like wages directly. And so looking at, okay, we've got a set rate that we're paying annually. And again, as a farm business, maybe it's difficult to compensate, but there might be other perks that would come in there. And I know you've had Dick Wickman on the podcast in the past, and I think bringing in these management practices is something he speaks pretty heavily to. But looking at what other equivalents might be added into this as well as part of a total compensation. So in many cases, we've maybe purchased property that has a house on it, and whoever's coming back to the farm kind of lives at that house or has, in some cases, rent paid for, things like that as they purchase things. So we look at some of those cash equivalents of wages. Are you getting a farm vehicle provided? Are you getting lower rent on your house? Are you getting groceries and things like that? And so what would a total compensation package look like, and kind of tallying up all those cash and non-cash equivalents? And then ideally some kind of formal conversation would happen around what might come additionally in equity. So, right, if you're kind of in a labor position and you're just starting back on the farm, it might not be as significant. But if you're working your way into management, this might be why you're having a yearly conversation around, does equity start to form part of that conversation? And so I think we see families look at it a number of different ways, whether it's a percentage of equity that they might form as part of that compensation that brings them maybe to more of a market value wage, or basically look at what the business needs and kind of work backwards from, well, over time, eventually we expect to transition this, so we'll give them this percentage over a number of years. Till this out here, we would use, a quarter section or a parcel of land might transfer to them. And so lots of different ways to do it. But I think looking at initially what compensation is, and then having a real value discussion with the whole family around, do we want to segment out a percentage of equity that adds to that compensation over time? And so that helps the families line up early on by just formally kind of writing out what it is and reviewing it every year to see what we might do to increase or that over time as they become more invested in the business.
Okay, fantastic.
And then something I was just going to add into that is in terms of one of the goals we have when we are dealing with the family is that everyone understands the process. And so the senior generation are able to explain to themselves, to the junior generation, what's going on here. And because this is a family dynamic, sometimes those non-farm kids are concerned about what's going on. And when you have a process and when you can explain that and you can have confidence that you've explored what that process looks like, it gives the senior generation some ability, some words to explain it to those non-farm kids. And that goes a long way in the whole peace and dynamics. That's maybe not the best word, but into those family dynamics to understand that this is not something that's trivial. There was thought process. There is a formal process with their business partner. And I do really encourage, even as the senior generation, for you to be using those kinds of terms to your non-farm children. Because the child, whomever stays home, they are not just the son in that kind of circumstance. They have an extended relationship. They have a more complicated relationship because they are taking risk. They're putting their mental time and stress into this farm. It's not just they're merely there. So I encourage people to review how they're actually even talking about the next generation that stay home to their non-farm children as well.
I love that. My goal one day is for every farm family out there to be clearly communicating. Lofty goal, eh? Hopefully I'll achieve that one in my lifetime, and it makes so much sense, right? Like, to me, and again, if I tend to go on little riffs, it's because I'm so passionate and I've seen this backfire. I've seen it tear families apart, and it's so easy. And if it's just handled a little bit different, a little more clarity, honestly, it's not just a business. By doing this stuff, you save families. Again, I own a media company. If stuff goes bad, well, it goes bad, and I'm horrified and devastated because I put my livelihood into it. But I don't lose family relationships with mom, dad, brother, sister, niece, nephew, cousins, right? So that's why I'm so passionate. Okay. Do you guys have anything to add on that? Because I have a good question. I think that's going to lead us into the next thing we wanted to talk about. Joel?
I would just add to your comment. I think beautifully said that this is that is the real joy of kind of being in this industry, is working in a family business and getting to work with family. And so it is something that, this is a tool that can help with that clarity up front and setting expectations that becomes so important, that when we're farther down the road and we're trying to go backwards in time, oftentimes I think we find working with families, we have a little bit different memories of what those early meetings look like or what expectations we set. So documenting it and working through a formula that is a best practice that makes night and day difference to families at the end of it, but also to the business relationship as well. So just wanted to add that getting it formally documented and down, and again, hoping that we can work towards a process where families are reviewing these yearly is something that could have a huge impact for our industry.
I love it. Hey, so I want to talk about different stages of the farm, different stages of people coming back to the farm. And I have a question that may or may not lead you guys into where you want to go, but seeing as I have a few more gray hairs and a few more years and a little more wisdom on coming back to a farm and building businesses, and again, being kind of in that middle age, I'm old enough to understand the parents and their pain and frustrations and concerns, but I'm young enough to understand the eagerness and the drive and the want for control, right? Like, you're just young and eager. So being in here, when you guys are dealing with family, is there an age where somebody just comes back to the farm? And we're not talking about equity yet, because they just came back and we need a period of time to just see if it's right. Because, looking back, again, we're young, we're eager, we want to come back and take over the farm. But being old enough and having built that, I don't think I would be open to that conversation right away. Just like hiring an employee. You know what? Come back. Let's make sure that this is a fit. Obviously, we're going to make it happen because you're family, but I think there needs to be a little bit of common sense there, right? We need that. Just come back. Let's work on this, but then not okay, you're here, we're not talking about it, right? So take that away. I want you guys to talk about the different stages and how that all works.
Absolutely. And that's a great example of why one silver bullet does not work for everybody. Because the reality is, somebody coming home in their early 20s, the conversation around sweat equity is going to be very different than somebody who's already put 30 years in, or somebody who has maybe a 75 or an 80-year-old parent that still owns everything. They're very different circumstances. And what Joel and I were thinking was that if we could talk through some of the examples that we've encountered, to give people some experience to say, that's my family situation. I get it. And so one example that I'm going to start with is where somebody watched one of our webinars on our events and came on and they said, I want to start this conversation. 22, just as you had mentioned. And they said, let's set up a meeting and talk to their parents. And they said, yes, let's do that. That's fantastic. So got to the table. And it didn't go like the 22-year-old had thought, because the 50-year-old thought that was so excited that the junior generation was moving it, because the 50-year-olds didn't have any equity yet. So they thought they were trying to help the middle, like the sandwich generation, when the 20-year-old was sitting there kind of like deers in the headlight going, I was talking for me. Oh. So we got to the table.
Yep.
We're working through it. But it's very difficult because there wasn't conversation. The 20-year-old didn't know that his parents didn't actually have an equity position. And so in the discovery of this, we had very different conversations. So for the 20-year-old, we don't want this to happen. We don't want this to repeat for you. You're going to need some patience, because we need to work through for that 40 to 50-year-old generation to be able to have some ownership. And then we're going to make sure that we're going to recognize your contributions. We're going to put some processes in place for compensation, so that when we deal with that 40, 50-year-old generation, then we're going to continue the conversation. We're not going to drop it like what happened with the previous generation. We're going to extend that conversation. But for the 20-year-old, that means they're going to have to be patient. And that wasn't their expectation. For that sandwich generation, they were, because they were tired of fighting for this. And so they were really proud and really excited to start this conversation, because they needed his energy to be able to start this conversation again.
Okay.
And so I think that's one example, and it's not uncommon. We have people living longer. There's a lot of people and a lot of operations and farms that have multiple generations still in the ownership kind of bubble, so to speak. And so that circumstance isn't nearly as unique as I think we would hope it is.
Fair enough.
Yeah, and I'd maybe tack onto that example just for that generation as they're coming in, and I guess maybe this is for everyone except for my dad, but that it is something a little bit about what's the policy when you're coming back into the farm and working into the farm too. That what expectations have you set when they come back to join things when they're there? Because at that point, I think you see a lot of eagerness early on to push things and to move forward and not be in that position. But I think if you kind of set those expectations, I always subscribe to Elaine, who you mentioned, to the, this farm transition is a choice that we're doing as a family. It's not necessarily like we owe a farm to somebody that has to meet the whole family goals of being able to retire out of the farm, provide for kind of two families, and come up with an arrangement that can match for both, and then keep that conversation rolling on how we can make this work for two generations as we kind of work together over time.
And that's the hard part. If you look at age and dynamics, and I'll go my grandfather, transition planning wasn't really a thing. We'll just leave it at that, respectfully. When he was, it didn't quite happen. So he expected his son to carry on and hold tight. And then one day it was a conversation, and here he is, 50 years old, hasn't even lived on the farm, hasn't worked on the farm, doesn't want to be that much in debt or a farmer at that point, right? So then it goes bad. But you look at different people I know, when you have the older generation and they're not used to this lingo, they're the hold it and pass it on. So now you have that sandwich generation. you can't help but wonder if there's going to be a little bit of resentment in there. And rightfully so. They want their kick at the can before the next generation. That's just human nature. If I was that sandwich generation, I'm a gracious person. I want to take care of my kids coming up, right? I do. And I want to do better than what was done to me. But I also want my time, my kick at the can. So that's really hard when you have multiple generations in there. And that's going to take some time to correct, a lot of time, right? Because we have generations and different levels of awareness. And I have always said it's not probably my grandfather's fault. Transition planning wasn't quite the discussion. They didn't have podcasts, magazines, all of you guys to help out back in that day where they're conditioned to that. It's the us, that sandwich generation, right?
And I think it's important that we take some time and understand what went on with that generation. They lived through the 80s, and there's very few conversations that doesn't still get brought up. That was a traumatic time for so many farmers that they had to live through, that they had to struggle through, that they had to fight for. And now they fought hard to keep these farms. They fought hard to expand these farms. And so the idea of breaking down the farm is emotional, it's overwhelming. And a lot of them, it's not that they don't want to see the next generation get it. It's not that they don't even necessarily, they want to continue the conversation, but they don't know how. Or in some cases, it's like it starts something bigger. So if I actually deal with this one aspect of making sure like the sweat equity is dealt with the one son, is that going to open a can of worms with the rest of the family dynamic? Because to that generation, it may seem like, well, we still have to figure out how we're going to deal with all of the kids rather than just the one. It's not a single conversation. And I would say that's a big part of the hesitation as to where do we start with this. And so for some of them, we'll deal with it in the will. Thank you very much. And for some of them, that very much is their process, that they're going to go to the lawyer and they're going to get it dealt with. And that for some other situations, like when you talk about scenarios, we do see that a lot where that senior generation just do not want to have this conversation. And we may have 2 or 3 generations behind them who were trying really hard to get them to see the value, to understand what kind of transition it's even going to be. And it's simply not a conversation they're prepared to have. And or because we have some elderly people, dementia becomes an issue, health becomes an issue. All of a sudden, they're not the people that they were previous. And that does complicate things. And so as we sit on here and we can talk about these circumstances, we can make them sound, easy. And this is what you're going to do to deal with them. But the reality is it's complex. The businesses themselves are very large and complex, but the people involved are too.
I've always said they call it the soft skills. I think that is baloney. They need to flip that because the technical, yes, of course, that's very skilled, but those soft skills and talking about all the hard stuff, to me, that is the hard stuff. I call that the hard skills. It's big, right? It's emotional. And there is nothing harder, to be honest, in business than people. And I deal well with people. I'm an extrovert. Dealing with people and meeting expectations is challenging, especially so on a family farm, right?
Yeah, and I'd kind of tack on again that speaks to really why I think a lot of people when they go through these processes get a little frustrated with the "it depends" answer, but it really does depend sometimes on what you as a family value. Right? There's always a saying Andrea and I chat about that if you've dealt with one family, that's one family and how they choose to solve it. And so every family's got a little bit of their own path. There's lots of common tools that are out there that families end up using, whether it's an accounting plan or the legal tools that are out there, but it really does speak to what they value and are going to come to an agreement on. So bringing in some of those hard skills with some of the math, the things to guide their process and conversations really add a lot. And I think the one thing that that maybe has changed from the next gen's perspective too is just kind of a little bit more of a desire to understand what to expect over time, that our businesses are becoming more complex in agriculture and there's more risk that's being taken and things like that. I think there's also a desire from the junior generation to know where they end up at the end of the day too. So there might be a few more pushing for that. And I think that helping them understand what those expectations might be over time is a good thing. So I always preach strategic patience when we're talking about sweat equity a little bit, that you're kind of being strategically patient for down the road. But helping lay out those expectations if they're coming back into the farm and they're maybe a little bit moving into that management stage, helping them understand what they can expect long term is something I always encourage families to really make sure they do set that process, so that you avoid the fights when it's we'll leave it all to mom and let her figure it out after kind of thing. That's what we want to avoid.
Amen to that. Okay, so I want to make sure that we've covered everything we want to cover. We've gone through how transition planning looks at the different stages. You guys have shared some examples. Did you want to expand on any of those points we've made up until this point? You guys have such good information. I love this. The boots on the ground. And I was saying with Andrea before you came on, Joel, the no silver bullet. I love cookie cutter. I love black and white. And honestly, my goal with this show was to come on here and get the guests on and then get this like black and white process to transition planning. I'm almost kind of embarrassed saying it, but I've done it enough now. I can laugh at myself, because I'd interview the first guest. I'm like, oh, but. And then the next one's like, wait a minute, like, give me some clarity. But it really is there. If farms were cookie cutter with the same number of land, animals, price of land, number of children, debt level, then we could get cookie cutter, but it's not, right?
Well, and I would argue even with the same number of land, animal units, kids is still going to be different.
True.
Because the family is different. The operation may be different. One may be more profitable than the other one. They may be carrying different debt loads. So you can't necessarily be driving by and say, oh, well, that operation is really similar to us. And we're going to follow their kind of transition plan, because as you say, there's no silver bullet. That doesn't necessarily work, because your transition has to be unique to you. And in terms, Joel and I sometimes talk about different levels of like discovery when you're trying to figure out how to even start your own conversation. And we have a DIY kind of version where families can start trying to, get themselves familiar with terms, what some of the issues are. And for Farm Credit Canada, under our website, you can click on knowledge, and there's a whole subsection called transition services. And in there we have different kinds of guides. So for creating business plans, top 10 ideas in terms of transition, starting that, talking in understanding the rules and responsibilities for the people involved. And that's a good way to start the conversation before you maybe pick up the phone to call, an advisor like Joel or I. And before, even if you're going to be going and talking to your technical advisors, like your lawyers and your accountants, you can start to do some of this discovery and understand the issues before you get there. And that's going to make you a little bit more confident in the questions that you're asking.
I love it. And, it's great. This is so big. I'm a farmer. And if I had farm children, I interview you guys and talk to you guys. And I feel comfortable now after 3 seasons this month of doing this show. I feel comfortable with some of these concepts, but it took me a while. So I could just imagine the farm families out there watching this, mom, dad, knowing they need to do this, being concerned where to even start, who to talk to. What about the non-farming kids? What about these kids? What about our income? So that's where I'm so happy to bring on you guys, all the amazing guests I bring on. And I wanted to do a call out to you guys, unplanned, because I do believe in advisors, right? It's that coach, it's that person that knows the subject. that knows the people, that knows the next step, that can deal with those soft, hard issues. So maybe speak to that. You gave a call out to research a little bit, get a feel, think a little bit. But let's say I'm Tracy, the mom, and I'm wanting to be diligent and start planning nice and early. I give you guys a call up, and how does that all work?
Yeah, really good point and question. So absolutely, your power to speaking to advisors, right? It's always a little bit of takes a village to transition a farm to some degree, right? And so I think something that we do a lot is trying to help with this early discovery piece. And so we try to help families understand where they can go, try to help them do a bit of brainstorming and soundboarding, and really try to sketch out a bit of what some process could look like for them and on their farm, and maybe answer a few of the common questions they've heard. So right, there's all kinds of great material out there that's out there on best practices. But with FCC, we try to bring that in and make it personal for the farm and the family to sort of sketch out what their goals and key objectives could look like, and then how we could connect them to other industry advisors that might be out there, or help them maybe empower them to broach these subjects with their current advisors that sometimes our advisors are in a little bit of a tough spot, that they don't want to suggest don't want to prod farms too much until the farm kind of asks for it. That sometimes we can kind of give them the words to bring it up with their own advisors and help them link to their accountants, their our own relationship managers, their lawyers, and different things that can kind of help add some technical pieces to what their goals and values might be as a farm family.
Love it. Really, like a coach in a sport, right? That's the way I look at it. And there's nothing wrong with going to your lawyer and talking, but this is so much bigger than just legal and tax, right? It's especially if the farm wants to continue on and there's multiple children, it's that coach that sees the field, says, here's the players and here can be our strategies to play this game, right? And I like that, because honestly, before transition advisors came out, who is there to talk about big picture? And you guys also, to me, what I love about what you guys do, so that farmers are not stranded having to figure this out on their own. You've been there, you've done it, you've seen it with different families. So you can start to go, okay, well, your family is different than XYZ over here, but this worked and they're kind of similar. And then this strategy, right? And you pull it together like that coach for the team. To be a little bit corny, but I see it that way, right? Instead of just going on the field and saying, hey, let's win.
Well, and even I think one of the biggest things that Joel and I do, and the rest of our team at FCC, is we take the big monster and we're going to start to shrink it down and put it into some bite-sized pieces, because the fear and the concern is that people are making a bigger narrative in their head about what this whole transition is, and that someday they're going to wake up and it's going to be a switch and everything's going to fall into place. And the reality is, it's a process. And so you're going to start with some information. So you're going to go out and you're seeking information, and that's going to give you the tools to continue that process. And so when we talk about transition timeframes, 5 to 10 years is happens in a short, like it goes by in a second. And secondly, that doesn't mean that it's going to take 5 or 10 years for any of the actions to be put into place. It means that this is going to be a gradual process. And so when we start to talk with them, it's a matter of, okay, so here's some of the longer term goals. What can we do for short-term actions to link you back with your technical experts to figure out what information you have to collect? Because one of the things that I do have to say to a lot of my clients that I work with is that transition is not a spectator sport. You have to play. Going back to your game commentary, yeah. You have to participate. And so you can't just pick up the phone and call a consultant and say, can you figure this out? Because they don't know your family. They don't know your family dynamic. They can read your business financials. They can read your production information from the farm. But so much of your transition plan is going to be specific to you guys. And I mean, you guys, meaning the farm that they're dealing with. And so you need to help guide the advisors, your technical advisors, to help create that plan. And the more information you can give them, the better the plan's going to be. So that's where we're kind of sometimes I feel like we're the cheerleaders and encouraging people to keep going.
Yeah.
Like, you started, let's go. Yeah.
The coach hat, and then you go to the sideline, keep on going.
Absolutely.
But, I also want to I try and draw on my experience from my business outside of farming. And when I was getting going and really scaling my company, I actually hired a consultant, a coach, because they have different knowledge than I do. And if I want to achieve different results, I need different knowledge put in my head with the help of a coach, right? But it took me a long time to get there, because we get those conversations in our head. And I can imagine farmers going, oh, okay, well, I know I need to do this, because I'd probably be doing the same. So not you guys, just me, right? I know I need to do this, but I don't want to, because you know what? I'm in the middle generation and I want to enjoy my kick at the can. And I don't want some advisor to come in here and tell me how it's going to be done. But I want to, drawing on my experience, we got to remember that we, as the one instigating this, are always in charge. And just because we start the process doesn't mean junior. Now I'm reflecting on my age where I'm at. If I have the next generation, yes, let's start this and make sure we're clear in setting this up. But I'm not ready to transition the farm. But we're going to be clear and have a plan and agree, hopefully, on when this is going to happen. But let's not forget that I'm the driver, right? And I'm bringing that up because getting out of your own way and asking for help is one thing. But then sometimes when we go to advisors, we forget that they're helping. They're not driving the bus anymore. They're helping and giving knowledge. And we got to say, hey, wait, I'm not ready. And it's our bus to drive. And I'm bringing that up because I've made those mistakes where you don't reach out because you don't want to be judged. Oh my gosh, they're going to think this. And then when you're working with them, oh, I don't want to say anything because they're the expert and I feel intimidated. So I'm purposely go with the bus analogy, throwing myself under the bus so that people can get out of the way, ask for help. But then when they're working with you guys, remembering that they're in control of that process, right? You can start the conversation here, but it doesn't have to finalized till over here. Long-winded, but I like to kind of bring my outside experience as a farmer and business person and things I've done wrong to maybe shed a little bit of insight. I'm done. Tracy goes on riffs in the show here. Oh.
No, I like it a lot. I think it's really important that that outside perspective that, again, right, I think it's always can be a little bit darkest when you're in the middle of it, but exactly that, you as a family can drive your plan and you get to make choices. And ideally, like I think there's always a tendency to default to maybe some of the negative things, but I think there should be a bit of a way to move these to some fun conversations that it should be exciting that you're getting to work with your family in a business that, in an industry that not everybody gets the opportunity to be in. So it's something that can be just a little bit of a mindset shift. And I know, even this past year, things like that just a bit of a mindset shift on how we build a transition plan can help set you on the right path too. That trying to put it in a little bit of a positive light and talk about some of the opportunities that we have. Exactly that, I think, is some good things that coaches out there in the industry or us can try to help turn that light switch a little bit as well.
Okay, fantastic. I was going to ask for some final words of wisdom, Joel, but that was pretty good. You guys talk much. No pressure. I want to make sure you guys have shared everything that you wanted to talk about before we work to share final words of wisdom and a final call out. I mean, we covered some great stuff. I love the boots on the ground and the examples and really that invitation that this is a conversation and a process, right? So floor is open if you guys want to share any final tidbits. If not, we will work to wrap it up.
Yeah, I think we could. certainly other examples and things that you can work through, right? I think that really to this process, I think there's other pieces that, whether generations are entering the business at different stages, or whether there's maybe a senior generation and maybe this conversation hasn't happened yet, it doesn't mean that it's too late either. That I think really, and I'll leave Andrea kind of with the take home point, because she's much more of a brainstormer than I am. There'll be a pot of gold there, but I think really what you're trying to use this tool for when we're talking about sweat equity is tying it into that transition plan, so that you've got matching expectations over time, and you've got a why and a reason for how the plan's going to continue forward. And doing it kind of when we're at an early stage helps that next generation come into the business, be clear of where they're going, and it helps the senior generation have that conversation later. And so making sure we're documented, and I'm still hoping we'll get to a process where it's something that gets reviewed every year as part of a farm family plan or business meeting. And so with that, appreciate you having me on, and I'll turn it over to Andrea.
Thanks, Joel. That was fantastic.
And really just to extend on what Joel said, because and not to harp on things, but the documentation is so important. Especially, I can share kind of a little bit of before I get to my last point, an example where father and son had been working together exclusively on the farm. Dad had a sudden death. Mom was left with it, with all of the assets, and then had to try to figure things out. And had been promises made, but they weren't documented. So when we're talking about these documentation, it's not a minor detail. People change over time, circumstances change over time, and that's okay. But if we understand and there's documentation to say what the intent was along the way, it gives everybody a supported place to speak from. And it gives some clarity to some really tough conversations, because whether it's that kind of a scenario, which is really traumatic, or if we're talking about, trying to come up with that sweat equity number, it's important to remember that if we can put some process in place, it takes that personal stress out of it. And this is hard for everybody. That's why we're having this kind of a conversation. It's because this isn't an easy conversation for anyone. And one of the end goals that I try to encourage with the clients that I work with is that you are able to explain it to each other, to that next generation, and to your non-farm children. And that kind of, it does a couple of things. One, it makes sure that you actually understand what's going on. And that's really important, because some of these conversations can be really technical. But on the other hand, it shows everyone involved that there's a process and that there's been intentional thought put into it, and that it's been done in a professional manner. And regardless of the decisions you make, when you can say that with confidence, it gives everyone a level of comfort with whatever the decision is, which is entirely up to the family. So back to your point of they're driving the bus and we're here to help. And so be open to sharing your circumstance so that your advisors can help you better.
That's fantastic, guys. That was a great conversation. And that's why I asked for final call outs, because I think like the best conversation, we go down rabbit trails and hop around and then grab the conversation back. So I want to make sure that you guys had a chance to share everything that you had wanted to share with our audience. So thank you, guys. I hope you enjoyed being on the show as much as I enjoyed having you. If people want to connect with an FCC advisor, whether it's yourself or anywhere they are in Canada, how do they go about doing that or finding more information? Like you mentioned earlier. Maybe if one of you guys want to give a call up. Sorry, that's the hard thing with two guests. I should name somebody and put you on the spot, but whoever wants to take that. If somebody wants to get in touch or learn more, how do they do so?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So I think for us there, there's no requirement to be an FCC customer. This is something that we do as kind of unbiased opinion and try to connect with others in the industry that can do this too, for those looking for more in-depth things. But absolutely, you can reach out to a local district office to reach us. So if you call your local FCC office is maybe one of the best ways to get in touch with us, or There are resources on our FCC website through our knowledge section. There's a ton of great information there in terms for transition material, as well as a way to contact us directly. And so with that, there's a number of ways. The best is typically through your local office, and they can track us down.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you guys so much for spending your time sharing your wisdom. As you can tell by my little riffs, it's a subject I'm really passionate about. You know what? I've seen good transitions and I've seen not so great. And I've dedicated my time in this platform to helping us do better as the next generation. So thank you guys for the work you do as individuals. FCC launching the transition team. I really appreciate that, and their business advisors. So thank you guys for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. This was a blast.
I know. Yeah. I wish I could go on. Like, why do we have to end these episodes? That's why I'm like, tell me more, guys. We could go on for hours, but maybe part 2 down the line. I'm doing a big focus on transition planning. So our paths may meet again and we can share more tales. Thank you guys so much. Thank you in the audience for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode as much as I clearly did, please like it, share it, get it out there so other farmers can hear Joel and Andrea's great wisdom. Thanks, guys. See you next week. Bye.
You've been listening to Impact Farming. For more great episodes and articles designed to help you manage and grow your farming operation, head on over to farmmarketer.com. Don't forget to sign up while you're there. We will see you on the next episode.